Welcome or welcome back, everybody, to another exciting episode of Aaron's Opinion, the podcast for blind people, where we speak about critical issues in the blindness community and all other issues from across the universe and galaxy. Today, we are very honored to be joined by Jeremy Opperman, courtesy there of Lois Strahan. And as I understand it, you have quite a story. As I will tell you, we probably, in fact, I promise you that this will be a multiple part episode with multiple days that we will record. I know we aren't going to get through everything today. But I just
Yeah,
want you
cool.
to go from the top and answer the question that I always like to ask. Who is Jeremy Opperman? Go.
Hey, Aaron. Hey, it's good to be here, and thank you very much. So, yeah, I'm just a regular blind guy. I'm in my 60s, early 60s, mind you. um, I've spent the last 25 years specializing in disability awareness, disability inclusion. Um, I was born with retinitis pigmentosa, although we didn't know it at the time because it hadn't actually been diagnosed in those days. But I was born with very poor vision, and it's deteriorated over the years. And now in my early 60s, it's almost all gone. So I just have light and dark at the moment. But what it did do was give me a very interesting life of understanding the moving feast that is blindness, in the sense that many people are obsessed with the idea that blindness is a binary. It's either off or on. It's either black or white, or sighted or not sighted. And people very rarely understand the concept of low vision. And I've had the privilege of experiencing low vision through its entire trajectory, um, to the point where I have nothing now, nothing usable, that is. And I find that quite useful when I provide advice and guidance to people with disabilities, people with low vision who struggle. That's not what I do for a living. I don't charge for that, but it is something I enjoy, is helping people when they hit that wall of visual acuity becoming less than they can handle, and they've got to deal with it. And because I've been there, I'm in a good position to be able to guide. But so yeah, that's in a very small nutshell. That's like me. But obviously, I can fill that out if you'd like to, if you'd like to give me some guidance.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Wonderful start. I think you're very right. Blindness is a spectrum, you know.
Yeah,
Why don't you expand more on what it was like if you're in your 60s? That meant that you were growing up in South Africa and basically in the 70s, where things were very, very different in society and things were very different in South Africa at that time. Why don't you
yeah,
first detail a little bit more about your childhood, growing up, the young days, the
sure.
schooling, all of that?
Okay. That's a good question. And so it's interesting. So I was born in what is now known as Namibia, which is the next door country to South Africa. Um, it used to be called Southwest Africa in those days. And South Africa had a dominion over it from a previous global agreement. And so I was born there. My parents had some experience of a child with a sight problem, because my older brother, who's much older than I am, 11 years older than me, also had a similar eye problem to me. And so they had quite a lot of experience. And he always grumbles because he reckons I got it easy because they were practicing on him. So the net result was I watched him going to a blind school and hating every minute of it. And this is a common issue with children with some sight, where there's that. I used to joke that we are not, well, in those days, we're neither the Old Testament or the New. With that blank page in between. You're not sighted enough to be blind, and you're not blind enough to be sighted. Um, and so it's a peculiar game. So I watched him hating school. I was much younger than him, as I pointed out. So I resisted the issue of going to a blind school or school for the blind, and I did not. And so I went through mainstream school, which wasn't easy. But I was able to muddle along, and I went to, after a couple of experiments with different schools, I went to a very small little school, and the smaller classes helped a great deal. And so I was able to muddle along. And so schooling was all right. I didn't shoot the lights out. I was no great student. Um, my only thing I excelled at was history and English when I finally graduated in high school. It was my two favorite subjects. And so I wasn't particularly good at sports, although I did a bit of athletics and a bit of swimming, but I wasn't competitive. But it was only when I got to university that I really realized what happens. And this is, I think, one of the criticisms of very tight institutions. So in my case, I went through a mainstream school, a conventional school, but had I gone to a blind school or a school for the blind and then gone to university, college, it would have been quite a shock to the system, because even for me, it was a shock to the system. Because in those days, there was no disability unit. This is now the very early 80s. And there was no disability unit, as they are now in all of our 26 universities in South Africa. Every one of them has some form of disability unit, department, if you like. But in those days, it didn't exist. And so that was a very interesting road to travel in realizing how unfriendly and how filled with barriers the experience of university was. But once again, I muddled along, and there I had a lovely cross-section of experience from wonderfully accommodating, kind, thoughtful lecturers and awful SOBs who wouldn't give me the time of day as a blind student, let alone helping me with notes and things. And so one had to find a way. And I think I was very fortunate. I was in the library one day and really struggling using a magnifying glass to read the index cards for a book. And a lady saw me, a librarian, and she said, I think we have a machine in the back room that would help you. And I had no clue about anything. And so we whaled it out of a back room, dusted it off, and it was what we now loosely call a CCTV reader or a desktop reader, but a very ancient one. And it worked. It worked. And so I was able to put a book underneath it or the index cards underneath the little camera, and it displayed whatever on the screen. And that, thank heavens, was for that. Otherwise, there's no way that I could have passed university. Because, now here's the downside of not going to a school for the blind, is that I had no braille. Not that that would have necessarily helped, because even those who have braille would have to have found a transcription service. But anyway, so I thank heavens for that machine. And so it allowed me to muddle along and pass. I got into a particular sport while I was at university, and I really enjoyed gymnastics. I had toyed with it a bit at school. And so I was able to be, for the first time in my life, I was actually competitive, and I went to, we have what's called South African University Competitions, SAUs. And so I was able to represent my university twice, which was a great thrill. And I was also in a school of residence, a hall of residence, they call it in the UK. And I don't know what you would call it. I suppose it's like a fraternity in the States, but without all the sort of Greek acronyms and things. It's just a hall of residence, and that was wonderful because it was very social. I met a lot of friends. They got to, and I think it was good for them too. They got to meet somebody who was utterly night blind, for instance, and they realized that they would need, if I was to join them at night, they would have to, and they were very, very good. They all got it, and there was never a fuss made. And so I loved my university time in that residence with my friends, and I'm very pleased because to this day I can literally call up at least 10 of them, and it's 40 years since I started that university career. So I made some lasting friends, and I think my blindness was good for them because they got to see something they probably wouldn't have seen, is a peer who was blind or visually impaired, I suppose you could say in those days. And I think that's important. So after university, I found the next great challenge, I guess, that everybody discovers is the world of work. And what a drama. So here I have my little degree under my arm, and I hit the road looking for a job. And I spent the whole of 1988 hitting that road looking for a job. And I looked rather peculiar because I would go in and get the interview, and then somebody would hand me a clipboard, and I would have to fill in the clipboard using a magnifying glass and holding my face really close to the paper. And I think they weren't prepared for something like that. And so I after a couple of sort of self-employment things that I tried, made a little bit of, I made RT. I was quite clever with, I still am quite good with my hands. I'm quite practical. So I made things and tried to sell them. And my brother and I started a furniture removal company at night. We called it Night Movers. And so I was, didn't make any money really, but I had to eat. I had a girlfriend, and she had a job, and I needed to find a job. And so my older brother, now 11 years older, as I said, had found himself in the most stereotypic job that you would associate with the blind, which was telephony, switchboard operation. And he said, I can get you the job. And I resisted at first. And then I thought, I've got to eat. And so I found myself in the switchboard. And it was in the Navy base. We have we're a coastal town, so we have a big Navy base here. And I was a switchboard operator for a year and a half. And I learned a very valuable lesson in that, because in those days, and this is what you were alluding to, is that the country was very different in those days. South Africa has been dominated by a racial domination, a white domination for 300 years. And it was only in 1994 where we had, thank heavens, a bloodless transition. But it came at a cost of many, many generations of persons of color being segregated for a start, and then definitely discriminated against. And they weren't allowed certain jobs. They couldn't go into the normal schools. They couldn't integrate in marriage. They couldn't live where whites lived. And so South Africa was a very divided country. But if you were part of the dominant white regime, you often overlooked, and you, especially a blind one, where you literally couldn't see what was out there. And I was quite progressive because the university I went to was very progressive. And so I was very aware that there wasn't a hell of a lot that a 25-year-old blind student, blind man could do on switchboard operation in a Navy. Now, the Navy, typically, being a military institution of a racist, of a very harsh police state regime, it was also very conservative. And I had gone to a very liberal, progressive university. And what was interesting in those days was that it wasn't uncommon to find people who had not graduated high school, and particularly in the military. They could never get to officer status, but certainly the non-commissioned officers and the non-commissioned personnel, many of them, I don't know what percentage, but a surprising number, had no what we call matric, which is high school. Final high school graduation. And so I found myself not only having a high school graduation, but also a degree sitting on the switchboard where my boss didn't even have a high school certificate, let alone his boss. And so there was this weird disconnect. There's this funny, blind, relatively well-educated guy on the phone, and many of the personnel not. And so I learned a very valuable lesson there about humility. And the second lesson I learned was that this is not exactly a difficult job. There are only 800 people in that entire part of the Navy base that I was working in. And, learning numbers is a trick. There are certain prefixes and certain suffixes of numbers which are a pattern, particularly in an organized institution. And so learning numbers wasn't particularly difficult for me. And so it wasn't difficult. And so I had a choice. I could have been bored out of my wits and done badly simply because I was bored, or I could have fun. And so I chose the latter, and I kind of enjoyed myself. And so I was very flirty on the phone, particularly with the women. I was kind of cheeky. I was a civilian, after all, in a Navy base, and so I could get away with that. And I learned to be good on the phone. I learned to be responsive. I learned to answer the phone quickly. I learned to be resourceful. I learned to be helpful. If somebody wanted something, I'd actually make it my business to find out, because I had nothing else to do. I might as well be helpful and useful and resourceful. And that paid off, because one day there was a wrong number. Somebody called, and literally a wrong number. And the lady said, "Oh, can I'm looking for something or other." And I said, "Okay, this is the wrong number." And she said, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry." And I said, no, don't worry. I actually know their number. I can help you." She said, "Really?" And I said, "Absolutely, no big deal." And so I gave her the number, and she said, "You have a wonderful telephone manner." I said, "Thank you." And she said, "Would you consider applying for a job with me?" I said, "Well, what do you do?" And she said, "Well, I run a training company and I need salespeople." So I thought about it for about half a second, and I said, "Sure." So we have a term here in South Africa. We call it pulling a sickie, which means you take a day sick leave, but you might not actually be sick. So I pulled a sickie the very next day, went for an interview, and she hired me on the spot. And so I got myself out of the switchboard. Now, that's quite an interesting thing, because it could very well have been my destination, because it would not have been difficult to slip into a comfort zone with that job. Not difficult at all. But my girlfriend, which incidentally is now my wife, was, what's the word? She viewed my situation with something of a jaundiced eye and said, I'm not sure this is you. I think you're destined for bigger things, than switchboard operation. And this doesn't mean, it just isn't meant to be sounding arrogant where, oh, there's something wrong with switchboard operation. Someone's got to do the job, and it's a good job. But it wasn't necessarily what I should be doing, she felt, and I agreed with her. So I got this wonderful opportunity of this job, and it was selling. I'd never sold a thing in my life, and it was selling to corporates, to companies, training. And I found it actually quite easy. And so before I knew it, I was running the call center. And then something happened. The business failed, not funny enough through lack of sales, but because one of the partners nicked all the money and went to America, mind you. And so the business closed, and I found myself being what we call here, being retrenched. You would say, let go. And so by that time, I had something of a reputation as a good salesman on the phone. And another consultancy hired me, literally almost on the spot. By that time, I was married, and my wife was pregnant with our first child. And I was very, very relieved to get this new job. Very similar job, just, a little bit more advanced, more selling, more marketing, and actually going out and meeting the clients as well, instead of just doing it on the phone. And I worked there for 6 years, and it was one of the best things I've ever done. And then, by that time, the computer, and we're talking around 1991 here, and the computer by now was landing on the desktop of people at work. Only few people in those days had computers. Small businesses couldn't necessarily afford computers for everybody. But I pointed out to my bosses that if I got a computer and I used what's called a database manager or a customer relationship management database tool, like in those days it was called Acrobat. No, I lied. It was called ACT. Um, I could probably work better and faster. And they muttered about it. And then I said, in addition, I'd heard by now of a thing called Zoom text. And I said, listen, this is all very new, but I think I can get funding for me using Zoom text. We had an American associate who very kindly sponsored my very first copy of Zoom text. And it was expensive. It was $400 back in 1991. And I said, yeah. And so I taught myself Zoom text. I taught myself ACT, and I took off, because I was much faster now than I was with a big felt tip pen on a legal pad, which is how I was working before. And I made this ACT thing talk to me, and I was able to, filter things and add everyone in, and it was great. I had a terrific time with this, and I had a terrific 6 years. And then sadly, there was another personnel drama in the organization, and once again, I found myself being retrenched. And I was picked up by another consultancy. That didn't last long because they were bought out by an IT company and they closed. And so finally, I got tired of being retrenched, third time now. And in 1999, I started my own business as a marketer, because by now I had a solid reputation as being a good salesman, particularly on the phone, mostly on the phone, and selling human resource products, training, leadership development, team building, consulting, coaching, that sort of thing. And I was doing nicely, thank you. And then suddenly one day somebody called me up and said, listen, I understand you're visually impaired, and I'm writing a book about disabled entrepreneurs. Can I come meet you? So I said, sure. And up to then, I had absolutely no relationship with the disability sector at all. I had no connection. I was simply a little blind guy doing my thing. Anyway, this guy came over, and very nice chap, and he was writing a book called Employing People with Disabilities. And I might point out that at that time, very interesting time in this country, because by now we had had transition. Nelson Mandela had been released from prison in 1990. They spent the next 4 years hammering out agreements between the old regime and the potential new regime, and writing a constitution. And finally, or actually the election came first, then the constitution. And so now we were solidly in the new regime led by Nelson Mandela. And a piece of legislation came out in 1998, the year before I went alone, which was called the Employment Equity Act. And I had no inkling of it when it actually came out. But when this man came to see me, he brought my attention to it. And on examination, it didn't take long to work out that the act was an affirmative action legislation. Now, affirmative action has a very bad rep in many countries, not least of which America and the West. Most affirmative action legislation or affirmative action policy is frowned on in many Western countries. And the reason for that is, in America, for instance, your African Americans particularly are only about 12% of your population, whereas in South Africa, our people of color, who had been discriminated against and segregated for 300 years, were 90% of the population. So the affirmative action model works very differently in that context, because you can absolutely see that it's a no-brainer to impose an affirmative action policy to ensure that more people of color would be employed. And the second designated group, of course, were women. Employing more women. Like many countries in the world in the 90s, women were underemployed, particularly in executive positions. And then surprisingly, the third designated group was disability. It was a fascinating inclusion. And so the Employment Equity Act, with this affirmative action requirement now, said you need to employ more black people. Fine. You need to employ more women. Fine. You need to employ people with disabilities. Huh? And the great majority, in fact, I think I'm correct in saying the entire employment sector stared at this expectation with absolute baffled look, because they had no clue about how to employ people with disabilities, because they had very little experience in it. Up till then, there had been no guidelines. Obviously, there had been people employed with disabilities, but with no guidelines. The concept of reasonable accommodation was anathema. It didn't exist before. That word literally wasn't in the lexicon in South African parlance at all. And so suddenly there's this thing, people with disabilities and reasonable accommodation, and wow. And so I found myself realizing that there was an opportunity, a niche, if you like. And so I started focusing more and more and more on diversity and disability specifically. I had by now a rich harvest, or a rich resource in many corporate and government clients who I had tapped into. And over the years. And so it wasn't difficult for me to knock on their door and say, about the Employment Equity Act, how are you doing with disability? And they'd all say, not very well. And I said, well, let's talk. And so a year later, in 2000, I created a program. I created a training program called Meeting Disability. And it was interesting because here's a lovely serendipity, because I had spent literally the last 9 years working in the training world. And so I knew how to create a program. I knew what a good program should have in it. Although I'd never trained a program before, I knew many facilitators. I had been through many training programs. And so to create my own program was easy as pie. And in those days, one could still do training programs could be as long as 2 days, even 2.5, 3 days sometimes. And so I very ambitiously created this program, 2.5 days, and which was a kind of model in those days. 2.5 days was acceptable. And I think now I've stopped counting after a while. There was a time when I counted assiduously, but I haven't counted for a while. But I'm pretty sure I'm now on just under 1,000 workshops that I've run since 1999. And the workshops I found over the next 25 years had to be shortened. And I cringe now at how much I had to leave off. Increasingly, there was a demand for training to be shorter. After 2.5 days, it was 2 days. And then suddenly it was 1 day. And now you're very lucky if you can get 1 day. And it's almost invariably a training program is about a half a day. And so a great deal of material now, sadly, has been left off. But I've been very strict about the structure of the training, and that it must not deviate from its original design, which was 3 pillars. And the pillars are what I call the why, the what, and the how. And coming from training, this is not a new concept. The adage in training is you have to have something for the head, something for the heart, and something for the hands. What that means is you've got to have something for the intellect in every training. You must have something to tap into the emotional. That's the heart. And lastly, you must have something practical in the training. That's the hands. And so I didn't like the order. And so I believe it should be heart, head, hands, particularly when training disability awareness. Because if you don't, the problem lies in people have no clue They have almost no experience of practical inclusion of people with disabilities. They've almost never met any, outside of perhaps the odd family member. They certainly didn't go to school with any. They hardly saw many of them in university. And they've never met any in the world of work, or very few. And so they've got absolutely no experience. So that's why the program's called Meeting Disability, because you need to engage with the concept at an emotional level. That's the why. And why is the most important word in any disability inclusion. Why? Why are there barriers? Why is there segregation? Why are we treated differently? Why? It's essential. And when one has got the emotional, and I do this through a couple of exercises. I've got one particularly important exercise that I developed right in the beginning, which is a visualization exercise, very, very powerful. And it hits them in the heart. It hits them at an emotional level. Then I hit them with the data. That's the what. The reality check, I call it. I look at a perspective view of disability. I look at the data, the numbers, the unemployment levels, the educational deficits, inaccessibility, public transport, that sort of thing, the market share, the business case. Those are good what questions, which now land a little better because they've got an emotional foundation. And only then do I do the how, which is how do you employ a person with a disability? How do you prepare your business to cater for your customers with disabilities? And this is where my workshop departs from almost all others, is that I take into account the business case. Is, do we consider people with disabilities as consumers, as customers? And the answer in this country is no. In America and the West and Europe, it's something that has been growing and growing, certainly for the last 10 years, where the business case is actually leading the employment case. In other words, there's a lot more energy towards considering people with disabilities as consumers. And that's the right approach. In this country, because our only legislation is labor legislation, remember what I said, it's the Employment Equity Act. We have no other piece of legislation supporting disability. And that was our great mistake in South Africa. Unlike America in 1991, where you got your Americans with Disabilities Act, and in Britain, the Disability Discrimination Act in 1995, we do not have one. We do not have in South Africa an overarching piece of legislation supporting disability. And even after 30 years of the new government, we are probably about 4 years away from one, because we have what's called a white paper, called the White Paper on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And that will eventually turn into a bill and then an act, hopefully, and shouldn't take longer than about 4 or 5 years maximum. But at the moment, we do not have it. And so all the energy in the country focused on disability is on employment. And that's a mistake, because we have no legislation to support and to demand and to obligate companies and even government to attend to people with disabilities at a consumer level. We have no legislation to support, let's say, housing or public transport or education. So, it's a very, very serious indictment, because we are, unfortunately, in South Africa, we had a great deal of catch-up to make. And because we had literally several hundred years of segregation, to undo that was obviously the priority. And so all the energy was obviously on racial parity and gender parity, with very, very, very little energy left over for disability. And so we are behind the curve. There's absolutely no question about it in South Africa. And that is, I am an apologist for us, because that's the reason, because we had a great deal to catch up on. Having said that, though, it's getting a little thin now, 30 years later, because we still are not handling the disability inclusion thing well. And so, in a nutshell, well, it's hardly a nutshell. That's a hell of a big nut. But that's really my story. In that time, from a personal point of view, my vision deteriorated and deteriorated, and I went from Zoom text after 20 years of using Zoom text. I went to screen reader in 2001. Sorry, 2011, and I went over and I went to Window Eyes, which was a wonderful program, brilliant program, and sadly, what are they called? Freedom Scientific bought it out, sadly. So you have no choice now but to use JAWS. And that was a hell of a learning curve. After 20 years of Zoom text, to suddenly then having to learn a screen reader was actually quite a drama, I must say. I lost a lot of functionality, and I'm not criticizing. I know many blind people are extraordinarily accomplished with JAWS, but it was difficult. And I was older by then. Anyway, I've been using a screen reader since 2011, and I discovered NVDA literally last year or 2 years ago, and JAWS just became too expensive to update. And this is where first world and third world are the difference is a problem, because I think relatively the updates in JAWS are very expensive, even in American terms, in dollar terms. But when you translate it to our weaker rand, and our currency is the rand, and at the moment it's about 17.50 or 18 to 1. So, $100 update is an enormous amount of money, or $200 update every year. So that's why so many people are going over to NVDA, and hats off to NVDA. And so I'm thoroughly enjoying NVDA. I'm not as slick as I should be with it. But that's my thing. On the other side, from a mobility point of view, as the vision deteriorated, I started using a cane in the late 90s. And then in 2007, I got my very first guide dog. And that was a game changer. That was an absolute game changer. And by then I was very busy, and I was flying up and down, flying to Johannesburg and Durban, another big city, and constantly. And flying with a cane is no fun. And the dog made such a difference. And so I always joke that I owe the South African Guide Dog Association commission, because the dog literally changed my business. And I became even busier. And it was terrific. And so I have now had 3 dogs. My first dog, of course, every person's first dog is an absolute genius, and there can't possibly be a better dog in the world, and we all feel that way. My second dog was a lovely dog, but he wasn't a great success as a guide dog, and so I had to fire him. And then my third dog, once again, was an excellent dog. And I got him in 2018, and very tragically, he died. He was only 5, and he died in 2022. And after COVID, every guide dog association in the world was set back hugely. Breeding programs stopped. And so there was a hiatus of dogs around the world. There was literally a shortage of dogs, breeding, sperm, training. And so there was a glitch in the system, literally a hiccup in the timeline. And so South Africa was no different. And so we're behind in our even now, 2 years after the end of COVID, we still have a longer waiting list than we would normally have. And so I'm still on the waiting list for my 4th dog, if I choose to go that way. I'm still debating, in fact, at my age now, where I don't work quite as hard as I did. I do a lot more work online. I'm actually debating whether, in fact, I need another dog. And perhaps it would go to somebody who needed it more than I. And then the last thing I want to mention is I discovered getting involved in the actual disability sector. in my career. So after 1999, I started getting closer to the various sectoral players, the organizations that serve people with disabilities. And I was invited to be on the board of several of them. And some of them were great experiences, some of them were awful. And the two that I've retained, literally the one that I've been on the board for 21 years, is what's called St. Dunstan's, which is our blind veterans organization. But we have two trusts underneath that in the same organization, but two separate trusts. One is a blind bursary scheme, and the other one is a funding program for mobility instructors. And that interests me greatly. The concept of orientation and mobility instruction is something we are desperately short of in South Africa. And so that's the reason I've stayed on with that board. And then in 2019, I was invited to be on the board of South African Guide Dog Association. So I guess all that good karma I had, in 2007 onwards, I'm paying back now. And other than that, I don't have a great deal, as we speak, to do with the disability sector. There was a very damaging time during COVID, and work became very difficult to get. There was a lot of pivoting going on, and suddenly learning to work online, which I loved. And so work hasn't been as fluid as it was. And so I'm paying more attention on the business. And I have, lastly, a new interest is audio description. I'd been introduced to audio description by who ostensibly the father of audio description, a wonderful man called Joel Snyder, who in America developed the concept at an industrial level, in a sense, really, and it took off in the 80s. And he came to South Africa 12 years ago, and I had the privilege of hosting him in Cape Town. And it was I had the most wonderful week with him. So I got an appreciation of audio description at an academic level, and I say academic because we have no audio description in this country. Our television has not discovered it yet, not without a lot of effort to try and incorporate it. And our only experience of audio description from a television point of view has been Netflix. Thank heavens for Netflix. And that's our only experience of audio description. But I'm very interested in heritage and museums and art. And I've started with a collaboration of a wonderful organization, been able to do audio description for museums and heritage sites and standalone sculptures, and I love it. I absolutely love it. So that's a sideline. It's not very lucrative, and I doubt it ever will be. But I do love it, and so it's something I intend to maintain. And that was a very long spiel, without a question.
And that was a very good spiel without me asking questions. That was incredible. You know, I was not afraid. I was not wondering if you're going to be able to talk during a 30, 40-minute period, because you South African people, you guys love to talk. You have the most beautiful way of talking, and even better, you don't stop talking. And when you talk, it's always good. So that was about the best. That was truly the best answer that I could have ever gotten out of you. And I just want to say, for one thing, thank you. That was amazing. I think that you, I have to be very frank with you about something.
Yes.
I would like to say that I would like to personally welcome you on the air here to certainly conducting a second and maybe even a third interview with me for a part 2 and 3. I would like to give you the privilege, only if you would like, of course, to come back and speak about your love for audio description and art, because what you did today was a magnificent summary of, including people with disabilities, the whole history, the whole part one of who Jeremy Opperman is. But I truly, genuinely feel in my podcaster's heart that you need a 2 and at least a 3 so that you
Sure.
can truly come back, and truly be able to expand on those other areas that you're interested in. And then we'll put it all together. And then in the end, you'll have 3 episodes to show, all of the wonderful South African friends and everybody around the world who tunes in. So, yeah.
Super. Sure.
Yeah, I just want to say that I really want to thank you for being flexible with me today. I know that it was a little hasty, maybe.
No, it's no
But
problem.
excellent. So because of that, because you were so graceful and nice about and graceful and understanding of me, I'll be understanding of more Jeremy Opperman. Generally, I would ask the question, and I'm not going to ask it today because I want to have a standard of you coming back so that we can fully finish the meal and fully allow you to learn, allow you to teach me everything that I need to know about you, because I can tell there is a lot more. There is at least 2 other areas that I have to pull out of you. I got to suck it out of you, the history part and the audio description part and the art part. And I'm determined to suck it out of you.
All right. No problem, man. No problem.
All right.
That's a good point.
But anyway, though, I hope that I really hope from my heart to yours, Jeremy, that you enjoyed your time here on Aaron's Opinion. I hope that this was a good springboard, a good starting point for you to get the feel of what a podcast like this is like. And we will, I would like to say that I would like to stop here, and I would like to say thank you so much. You did a magnificent job. We will be in touch very soon.
Excellent.
Later today, in fact, and I will be able to explain personally one-on-one a little bit more about what was happening, because you kind of didn't get the full story there. But I will explain to you a little bit more.
Sure.
I'm sure you can understand this when I tell you that in life, sometimes we have other commitments to go to, and I do have to be on time. Luckily for my next commitment that I cannot get out of. So I hope that you understand, and I hope that we will talk. Excellent,
Brilliant.
Jeremy. All right.
Thank you.
You are forever welcome here. We will be in touch later today. All right, man.
Magic. All right. Cool.
Super. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening. As we say at the end of each episode, help 1 person today, help 1 million people tomorrow. We will be back soon.